It had been so long since anyone had seen dusk that people began to doubt whether purple truly existed. Children born beneath the reign of High Autarch Helior grew up with heads bowed, eyes squeezed shut against a merciless white sky that never cooled, never softened, never let crickets or lovers or dreamers claim the hush of night. Their parents still remembered the lavender hush that once poured across the western horizon every time a storyteller ended a tale, and the soft yellow dawn that always followed the first words of a new story. But memory dried inside them the way ponds shrank beneath Helior's punishing noon, until even nostalgia tasted like dust. For generations before the Autarch, the cycle had been simple. A bard would stand on a porch, or a haycart, or a palace dais and begin, "Listen," and the eastern rim of the sky would glow with timid pink. Through twists of plot and rhythm of voice, morning brightened to gleaming midday. When the tale at last found its closing line, the sun respectfully slid toward the rim of the world and vanished. In that interval, called dusk, people ate meals, lit lamps, whispered confessions, slept, and dreamed new adventures for the next dawn's teller to release. So natural was the rhythm that nobody had questioned it, until Helior, a general-turned-monarch, acknowledged its power aloud. He ascended on the back of a civil war, draping the nation in banners stitched with a blazing disk. Where earlier kings had merely enjoyed stories, Helior feared them. A single children's rhyme could, by ending, command the sun itself. What might a cunning rebel accomplish if she chose her ending carefully? And so, on the morning after his coronation, Helior ordered every public square cleared of minstrels. His soldiers broke lutes, burned scrolls, and nailed the tongues of 3 famous poets to the gates of the royal zoo, where parched elephants trumpeted at the smell of blood. When the noon refused to budge because no tale concluded, Helior declared the unmoving sun proof of his eternal dominion. 10 years passed. On the outskirts of the capital, beneath a cracked aqueduct, a girl named Leora practiced speaking with her eyes closed. She had never known real twilight, yet a rumor sang inside her veins, born of her mother's hushed lullabies, that the sky once listened to words. Leora's mother, Marat, had been a village yarn spinner, one of those who never finished a story after Helior's decree, choosing silence over complicity. The Autarch's soldiers chained Marat in the glass garrison, where noon's light was focused by mirrors until flesh blistered. Leora, only 9, escaped with nothing but a handful of half-remembered openings. There once was a path made of echoes. In the beginning, the river dreamt it was a girl. Now 19, Leora knew 2 things with certainty. First, that a story possessed the strength to topple a tyrant. Second, that every tale needed listeners. She had discovered the first truth the night she found her mother's tongue. Preserved, terrible, gray, and shriveled. In a jar the soldiers had discarded. Leora wept, not only for the mutilation, but because the dismembered muscle still hummed. It tried, though uselessly, to form syllables against the glass. Magic, she understood, clung even to orphaned tongues. The second truth she learned among refugees who huddled beneath colonnades at the city's edge. Words alone were embers, an audience's breath made them fire. But who in Helior's dominion dared listen? The secret guild called the Nightward Circle thought they might. The circle was older than empires, a lineage of librarians, sailors, parchment makers, widows, and midwives who tromped across centuries, delivering stories where they were most desired. Some said they were the first to discover the sun's obedience. For 40 seasons they had lain dormant, their meetings snuffed out by the Autarch's spies. But darkness, or lack of it, proved a powerful recruiter. When dreams grow as restless as mosquitoes in unending daylight, people crave sleep enough to risk rebellion. Leora found the circle after following a chalk sigil, a little spiral drawn on a well stone. From the spiral, she looked east at moonrise, that is, where moonrise ought to be, and counted 7 breaths. A door swung inward, where only plaster had existed, revealing a subterranean chamber, lit by lamplight the color of apricots. Elder Joss, keeper of the circle, studied Leora's calloused lip as she entered. Years of stolen whisper practice had scarred the skin. The elder nodded in recognition. This girl carried stories the way a blacksmith carried sparks in her hair. "Speak your beginning," Joss said. "I don't have a whole tale, only hunger," Leora replied. "Hunger is a fine first sentence," the elder said. So the guild took her in, teaching her the old crafts, how to pause to let listeners lean forward, how to braid 3 plot lines into one, so that even an inattentive goat would lift its head, how to end a chapter in such a way that the sun's rim caught on the horizon, but did not descend. All the techniques that once apportioned daylight fairly. Yet finishing remained forbidden. The autarch's sentries patrolled even echo chambers beneath the earth, fitted with little brass mice whose ears recorded vibrations. Helior himself studied the mechanisms of acoustics, funding a laboratory of silence staffed by impoverished mathematicians. Rumor said he planned to freeze air molecules so that spoken words would simply stop a handspan from the mouth. Until that nightmare matured, soldiers sufficed. So the circle rehearsed endings only in gesture, shaping invisible periods with their fingers rather than tongues. As months gathered, Leora realized a paradox. To oust Helior, they needed to finish a story in public, but to gather a public, they needed to promise safety from Helior's reprisals. Despair nipped their ankles. One sweltering afternoon, as Leora emerged from the guild's secret door, she noticed something new, a faint gradient in the color of the sky over the distant sea. Not purple, nothing so grand, but a blush of apricot deepening to rose. She rubbed her eyes. The hue vanished. Dizziness struck her with a theory. Somewhere, someone had dared to conclude a tale, if only a sentence, before being cut off. That momentary punctuation had nudged the sun a finger breadth. Hope proved more potent than bread. It fed everyone she told. The guild argued all night before deciding. Joss insisted they needed an ending so undeniable that Helior himself must become audience, for only then could the sun be certain no larger final word awaited. A story about the autarch, Leora proposed, from cradle to now. If I tell it truly, he must recognize himself in its mirror, and when I reach the last line, the very moment he expects me to beg mercy, I'll simply finish. The enormity of such defiance cracked the lamplight, but Joss placed a frail hand over Leora's and said, "Stories choose their tellers. It seems yours has chosen you." They prepared the ground beneath Helior's own palace balcony. First, they seeded rumors of a miracle healer appearing at noon on the Festival of Zenith, to lure crowds with their ailing. Next, they bribed the clock keepers to jam city bells just as the fake healer arrived, stalling all other spectacle. Finally, they freed caged nightingales and let them fly above rooftops, a forbidden symbol that promised the return of dusk. Helior, hearing unrest, postponed his feast of spiced ostrich and strode to the balcony, ringed by crossbowmen. Below, tens of thousands thronged the plaza. In their midst, disguised as a mendicant with a patched shawl, stood Leora. She didn't climb a platform or unhood her face. She only spoke. The first words slid beneath conversation like a creek under ice. In the womb of a roaring woman, a child of fire was born, and the midwives called him Helior, for they feared the heat of his gaze. Breath by breath, talking ceased. Even pigeons seemed to hush. Leora told how the child burned his first cradle, how his father sold shadows to purchase shade, how a general taught him to wield fear as armor. Each paragraph traced a decade until the Autarch recognized himself, mythologized but unmistakable. His jaw tightened. Yet some mortals, when confronted with narrative, cannot look away. Helior was such. Leora saw his nails bite the balustrade. She wove secondary arcs. The baker who lost his wife to sunstroke, the astronomer who forgot the constellations, the shy barber who loved afternoon naps, and always the noon above that refused to bend. While she spoke, clouds thickened at the very edges of heaven, as if summoned to bear witness. Paler gold bled toward ember. The crowd's faces lifted, astonished. Their pupils expanded, with a sensation long forgotten. Onset of shadow. Helior commanded his guards, "Silence her." But the guards found themselves listening. Speech turned their spears sluggish. Leora's voice galloped through imagery, conjuring a canyon where every echo was a child crying for lullaby. Then at last, she reached the present moment. There stands a man upon a balcony, cloaked in stolen daylight, but the light is weary, and the man has no tail left to bleed into it. She stopped. Not a gasp, not a murmur. Just a pause pregnant with eons. A finishing line still hovered in the air, unspoken, fragile as the membrane of a bubble. The sun hung mid-sky, tilted. If she ended now, dusk would roar across nations. If she failed, Helior would order her tongue shorn like her mother's. For a heartbeat, she felt Maret's voiceless grief rattling the jar hidden in her satchel. The crowd felt it too. They leaned forward, urging. "I end my telling," Leora whispered. The words were simple, ancient, full as a gong. They struck the sky. Light staggered. A horizontal bruise surged westward, bruising topaz into burgundy. Crickets, who had known silence for a decade, shrieked in sudden chorus. Flowers folded. Shadows stretched for the first time beyond the length of a man's fear. People screamed not from terror but relief. The world was exhaling. Helior, disbelieving, shouted lavish curses, but his voice scattered like scared gulls. He drew a jeweled dagger and flung it earthward. Yet before it found its mark, twilight thickened around the blade, slowed it, and settled it harmlessly among cobblestones. Crossbowmen discovered their bowstrings slack with dew. Night fell, full, velvety, crammed with stars that had waited behind the blue glare for 10 punishing years. Lanterns blossomed as though having rehearsed this cue since time's dawn. Leora sagged, drained, but hands lifted her, carrying her as pilgrims carry relics. Above, the Autarch's torches looked paltry compared with constellations, but revolution is not won by sunset alone. Helior still gripped armies. His scholars might find a way to freeze language. The Circle knew the next dawn, inevitable after any ending, could see reprisals, so they enacted the second phase. All night runners carried embers of Leora's tale to neighboring provinces, telling it anew, finishing it again at every market square. The sun, uncertain whose cadence to follow, lingered in elongated twilight. Between each retelling, it dipped lower, until by the time dawn ought to have returned, a thin ribbon of ruby clung at the horizon, but darkness stayed sovereign overhead. Helior felt his certainty fracture. If stories could stall both noon and dawn, his calendar army, parades planned 6 months in advance, taxes scheduled by sundial, would founder. In desperation, he unlocked the laboratory of silence and commanded scientists to devise an inverse machine, one that would freeze not words, but the storytellers themselves. "Stone," he said, "must replace their throats." Elder Joss anticipated this. Throughout the years of secrecy, the Circle had preserved not merely living bards, but seeds of stories, vines of possibility that any mouth could sprout. Now, while Helior's alchemists toiled, Joss dispatched messages written on fig leaves. "Tell anything, end it truly. Pass the dusk along." Peasant women trading eggs for onions finished jokes to coax roosters into sleep. Fishermen shouted the punchline of dirty sailor tales, and tides responded with moon-pulled rhythm. Toddlers mumbled nonsense, culminating in decisive, "done," and fireflies rose around their cribs. One dawn, no, that is misleading, for dawn had been postponed. One eventual gray-violet hour, Helior marched to the plaza, dragging a petrified scholar whose sin had been weeping mid-experiment, thus cracking the silent spell. The Autarch hoisted the stone body onto a fountain and declared, "Behold the cost of narrative." Yet as he spoke, his own words, ironically, formed a tale with beginning, middle, and unbeknownst to him, an ending. "And so I decree," he concluded, "that henceforth language shall serve only me." The crowd blinked. Somewhere an old woman in mourning black lifted her chin and intoned, "Language serves itself." With that rebuttal, Helior's speech found its unexpected final punctuation. The sun, grateful for the clarity, dipped below the lowest roof. Night answered instantly. Helior reeled, realizing he had concluded the very story of his tyranny. He retreated to his palace, but dusk traveled with him, room to room, unafraid, an inky hound. When he sealed himself behind iron doors, shadows pooled in corners like liquid wolves. Some say he is still alive, pacing a single chamber, lit by a candle he dares not extinguish. Others claim the darkness swallowed him whole, digesting arrogance into myth. Either way, power passing into myth is just another name for losing it. With the Autarch's authority unraveled, governance tumbled into citizens' hands. The fever of storytelling would not be contained. Night and day began to rotate again, yet no longer bound to a lone bard's voice. Rather, multitudes shared the task in great woven choruses. At sunrise, a baker might announce a recipe. By noon, a magistrate would arbitrate a land dispute. By sunset, a chorus of children would finish their playground epic, and the sun, obedient but content, retired. Variety saved the realm from tyranny of any single mouth. The Nightward Circle did not disband, but it opened its doors so wide they vanished, becoming every threshold where someone said, "Listen." Elder Joss, joints aching, returned to cataloging seeds, believing agriculture and imagination equally sacred. Leora, though begged to become High Chancellor or Poet Laureate, refused both. She traveled instead, collecting fragments left half-finished during Helior's decade. Lullabies aborted when soldiers knocked, legends abandoned by mortally wounded heroes, jokes cut off at the setup, completing them so their ghosts could rest. On the anniversary of Dusk's return, people gathered on beaches, rooftops, and forest glades. As the final sliver of sun kissed sea, a hush fell wider than any edict. Leora stood beside a driftwood fire and addressed the night. "Once we feared an endless noon. Now, let us fear only a silence that belongs to no story." She opened her hand. Inside lay her mother's preserved tongue, which she had carried all this time. The relic had dried to a fragile petal. Leora laid it on the coals. Flame curled around it with a hiss, and for the first time in 10 years, the organ was warm, free, reactive. A puff of smoke rose in the shape of words unspoken, words of every mother who had ever hushed a child to sleep. Leora listened, tears trembling like lantern glass, and when the smoke dispersed, she felt no weight in her satchel. only wind. Frogs began to croak, cicadas to sing. None of them spoke a human language, yet even the creatures were stories moving through living throats, and their nightly endings twined with humanity's own. The sky, wide, wild, grateful, shifted from black to softest blue as someone, far away, opened with, "In the beginning." When pale dawn finally climbed the cliffs, it met a world neither chained nor naive, for people had learned how easily daylight could be weaponized. In every village they elected keepers of endings, whose sole duty was to ensure no voice, however humble, was forcibly stilled. And whenever a speech or ballad or bedtime fable neared its final period, listeners bowed their heads in reverence, honoring the sacred marriage between silence and completion. As seasons twirled, the balance held. Some nights were brief, some long, according to the shape of collective narrative. Nobody minded. They had rediscovered that the sun, for all its brilliance, preferred to be guided rather than seized. And in the hush between the last sentence and the first star, Leora sometimes thought she could hear, scattered across the dark, thousands of storytellers finishing together, each giving the sky permission to rest. She would smile then, tuck a blanket under her chin, and sleep. Grateful that the world, at last, belonged to its stories, and its stories belonged to everyone.